Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a topic that is literally everywhere in the headlines, but honestly, it's still so often misunderstood. We're talking about why inflation risks remain high, despite what the latest monthly data might be telling us. Okay, let's dive into this, because there's this persistent, kind of dangerous illusion out there right now that inflation is just a completely solved problem.
There's a quote going around right now that perfectly captures this illusion. It goes, every time headline CPI ticks down 1/10 of a point, someone declares victory over inflation. And isn't that exactly what we see happening? Every single time there's a tiny dip in the consumer price index, or the central bank pauses rate hikes for a second, someone gets on TV and immediately calls the top of the rate cycle. But then, sure enough, a few quarters later, those exact same structural pressures rear their heads again. It's just a relentless cycle.
So that brings us to the really pivotal question we need to figure out today. Are the forces driving inflation truly gone, or are they, literally, baked into the system? To answer that, we really have to pull our focus away from the daily news cycle and those monthly data drops. Instead, we need to look under the hood at the underlying decade-long structural gears that are just turning away in the background of the economy. These are not forces that get resolved in a single news cycle. And to really grasp this, we need to examine two primary structural gears.
Section 1. The fiscal gear, a debt machine with no reverse.
All right, let's ground this abstract math in a stark, very urgent reality. $40 trillion. The U.S. national debt just crossed this massive threshold. When we talk about macroeconomic theories, it is so easy to get lost in the academic weeds. But this number right here, this is the concrete, unavoidable math problem sitting right at the absolute center of the inflation debate.
But here's the thing, the total debt is really only half the story. The other half is what it actually costs to carry that debt. Right now, 3.4% is the weighted average interest rate on that massive $40 trillion stockpile. Now, just to put that into perspective, barely 5 years ago, that rate was sitting at roughly 1.5%. So what does that mean? It means that as older, cheaper debt matures and rolls off the books, it is being refinanced at today's much higher rates. The government's interest bill is growing rapidly, even if they don't borrow another single dime.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how that interest rate translates into actual real-world government spending. Net interest payments now consume a staggering 14% of all federal outlays. Just interest. That leaves 86% for literally everything else. But remember, a huge chunk of that remaining 86% is essentially non-negotiable. Things like entitlement spending and a defense budget that's under intense pressure from global instability. So what we have is a highly rigid budget where the cost of simply maintaining the debt is just eating up a larger and larger slice of the pie.
So what happens when a government gets boxed into this kind of a mathematical corner, especially when neither political party has the appetite to actually run a surplus? Well, there are exactly 3 ways out. First, you can try to grow your way out of it. But let's be real, that is incredibly difficult when your growth is being financed by taking on even more debt. Second, you can default, but for the issuer of the world's reserve currency, that's just unthinkable. Or third, you can inflate the debt away in real terms. When we look back at history, the inflation valve is the lever that gets almost universally pulled. And that leads us directly into our second structural force.
Section 2. The monetary gear. Fiscal dominance and quiet pressure.
Okay, so we have to look at how the Federal Reserve collides with those massive borrowing needs we just talked about. Let's contrast two competing realities. On one side, we have the Fed's formal mandate, price stability and maximum employment. But monetary policy doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? It operates right in the shadow of the Treasury's reality, financing $40 trillion in debt. And we are seeing this tension play out right now. Even with inflation running above target, around 3.4% year over year, the Fed has kept its target range somewhat constrained near 3.5% to 3.75%. Why? Because every single rate hike doesn't just cool off consumer demand, it directly, immediately raises Washington's own interest bill.
So the crucial point is what economists actually call fiscal dominance. Basically, it's when a central bank functionally becomes an arm of debt management, rather than acting as a fully independent inflation fighter. The central bank structurally cannot afford to keep policy tight for very long, because the government structurally cannot stop spending. Now, this rarely announces itself with a megaphone. Instead, it shows up quietly. It looks like just one more rate cut than the economic data actually justifies year after year.
And this dynamic creates what we call the ratchet effect. Now, I want to be clear here. Neither side is being villainous or incompetent. Actually, scratch that. They're both just responding totally rationally to the incredibly complex incentives right in front of them. Both the Treasury and the Fed are doing what makes sense in their respective silos. But the combination means the printing press essentially acts as a pressure valve. Each cycle of temporary accommodation resets the baseline of the currency just a little bit higher, quietly debasing the currency over time. So if we step away from the macroeconomic theory for a second, how does this actually apply to you?
Section 3. The Solution. The Hard Asset Playbook.
Let's take a strictly impartial look at how an individual might actually navigate this mechanical reality. We're looking at a pretty stark contrast between two categories of holdings here. On the one hand, you have hard assets, things like real estate, gold, and equities. On the other hand, you have paper promises, meaning fixed nominal paper like cash, long-duration bonds, and fixed pensions. The really harsh reality of fiscal dominance is that the people holding those fixed paper promises are the ones quietly subsidizing the deleveraging of the world's largest debtor. Their purchasing power is literally what's being eroded to balance the equation.
So what does a hard asset playbook actually look like in practice? Basically, it centers on assets whose value doesn't rely on a government's promise to repay you in undebased dollars. First up, real estate and productive property. Its replacement costs reprice with inflation, and if you have leverage, you're actually repaying it with cheaper future dollars. Pretty smart, right? Second, commodities and gold. Gold has been the absolute classic hedge against currency debasement across dozens of monetary regimes throughout history. Third, equities, but specifically businesses with genuine pricing power, the ones that can just pass rising costs right on to their customers. And finally, for the more conservative allocator, instruments like TIPS and I-bonds offer an imperfect but very direct conservative hedge. Now, to maintain our journalistic integrity here, we really do have to examine the other side of this debate.
Section 4. The Steelman. The mainstream counter-argument. You might be wondering, why aren't mainstream economists universally predicting doom and gloom? Well, take a look at these 4 distinct rationales, and this brilliantly illustrates the other side of the coin. First off, the US dollar is still the world's dominant reserve currency, which provides a level of financing flexibility that a country like Argentina simply doesn't have. Second, the Fed still maintains a remarkably strong institutional culture around fighting for that 2% inflation target. Third, we have tech and AI. Massive productivity gains from technology could act as a huge deflationary force, potentially offsetting all that fiscal spending. And finally, historical precedent. I mean, people predicted unsustainable debt crises back in 2011 and again in 2019, and that runaway inflation just didn't happen. So reasonable, highly intelligent people can absolutely disagree on how much weight to give the dollar status and AI efficiency versus the sheer, massive scale of today's $40 trillion debt.
We really want to move away from confident doomsday predictions here and instead build a logical framework for your decision-making. Let's move to and see how this builds into the concept of asymmetric risk. Think about it this way. If the fiscal dominance thesis is entirely wrong and the mainstream economists are totally right, hard assets like real estate and strong equities still tend to perform perfectly reasonably over long-time horizons. But if the thesis is right, being underhedged and paper promises is incredibly costly. What this means is that owning real assets alongside financial ones isn't just about placing a bet on inflation. It's a mathematically sound strategy regardless of which camp you happen to fall into.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to help you evaluate your own financial reality. If the inflation ratchet does click higher, driven by those unstoppable fiscal and monetary gears, is your portfolio actually positioned for the reality of the math? It's really not about fear. It's about understanding structure, incentives, and positioning yourself in a world where the debt machine has absolutely no reverse gear. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the headlines.